waiting for a man, a riverboat gambler.
Levon Helm, legendary drummer of the band, wasn't just a rhythm keeper. He was a guardian of American musical soul who viewed drumming as more than just technical prowess. It was a spiritual responsibility. Helm's deep Southern roots and soulful drawl masked an unrelenting demand for musical authenticity, and he drew an uncompromising line in the sand when it came to how drumming should be done. To him, drums were never meant to steal the spotlight, but to ground the music, holding everything together with a heartbeat that resonated from generations of cultural struggle and joy. Helm believed that real drumming didn't dazzle with fireworks or bury itself in cold precision. It breathed, it danced, and it bled with emotion. His life's work was about feeling, not formulas. That passion manifested in an intense dislike, some would say outright hatred, for drummers who broke this code. Whether they were world-famous legends or MTV darlings, Helm made no exceptions when he felt a drummer had violated the soul of rhythm. He didn't just see bad technique, he saw cultural betrayal. The following are 6 drummers, each a giant in their own right, who made Helm's blood boil. Not because they lacked talent, but because in his eyes, they forgot what drumming was truly supposed to be about. These weren't casual critiques. These were declarations of war in a battlefield where authenticity fought against spectacle. Feeling clashed with perfectionism, and tradition stood firm against innovation that, in Helm's view, had lost its way. With every critique, he wasn't just defending his own legacy. He was speaking for the roots of music itself. When Levon Helm first witnessed Tommy Lee's upside-down, spinning drum solos on MTV, his face reportedly twisted with disgust, and, without hesitation, he turned the TV off and walked away. It wasn't because Lee lacked talent. Helm acknowledged energy and showmanship could be entertaining, but because, in his words, Lee had forgotten that drums are supposed to support music, not distract from it. To Helm, Tommy Lee's entire approach represented a perversion of what the drums stood for. While Helm spent decades perfecting the art of fading into the groove so subtly that the listener almost forgot the drums were there, Lee turned his kit into a flashy amusement park ride. Helm reportedly called it acrobatic nonsense, lamenting that music had been reduced to visual stunts rather than emotional storytelling. The final straw for Helm came during a 1988 music industry event where drumming innovation was being discussed, and Lee was celebrated as a pioneer. Helm walked out, later telling organizers, "Innovation means better music, not better stunts." He wasn't being a curmudgeon. He believed Lee's influence was causing younger drummers to chase fame through shock and awe instead of learning, to listen, to feel, to serve the song. "Real drumming," Helm once said, "should make people feel the song deeper, not make them forget there's a song happening at all." In his eyes, Lee's obsession with theatrics was the beginning of the end for drumming as a sacred craft. It wasn't just about taste. It was about what Helm saw as a cultural shift away from soulful authenticity toward empty spectacle. And he wasn't willing to let that slide. Levon Helm's disdain for Metallica's Lars Ulrich didn't stem from volume or aggression. Helm could appreciate powerful energy, but from what he called the robotic pounding that stripped drumming of its human essence. When Helm listened to Metallica's Master of Puppets, he reportedly shook his head in sorrow, remarking that Lars sounded like he's punching a time clock. For Helm, drumming was a living conversation, a dialogue between instruments, emotions, and souls. But what he heard from Ulrich was mechanical, lifeless, and cold. The rise of Metallica in the late 1980s was accompanied by a cultural glorification of precision timing and double bass pedal technique. Helm, horrified, watched drumming evolve into something he described as music that marches, not dances. At a 1990 drum clinic, when asked about advanced techniques, Helm refused to demonstrate any flashy moves, declaring instead, "I'm here to teach you how to make music dance." not how to make it march. To Helm, Ulrich represented everything wrong with where modern drumming was heading. A style that prioritized perfection over pulse, exactitude over emotion. Music should sway like a tree in the wind, Helm said, not clatter like factory gears. The more popular Ulrich became, the more Helm feared that generations of organic groove would be lost to a new wave of computerized feel and industrial stiffness. In his view, Lars wasn't just playing drums, he was burying rhythm under concrete. Helm's reaction was not mere stylistic preference. It was mourning the loss of soul in an era that worshipped flawless execution over feel. And to Helm, that wasn't just wrong, it was tragic. Levon Helm's frustration with Stewart Copeland wasn't born from jealousy or rivalry. It was rooted in the belief that Copeland, the pulse behind the Police, was single-handedly turning groove into a math problem. While the world applauded Copeland's explosive creativity and his knack for weaving reggae, punk, and rock into complex rhythmic patterns, Helm stood apart, calling it show-off drumming that distracted from the song itself. To Helm, Copeland's problem wasn't lack of talent, it was a lack of restraint. According to those close to Helm, he watched Copeland with growing annoyance, reportedly saying, "Stewart's got more chops than he knows what to do with, and he's using every one of them. Every single song, every single time." During the early 1980s, when the Police were riding high on critical acclaim, Helm lamented how drumming was being praised not for how it supported music, but for how, loudly and intricately, it could demand attention. At a 1984 music workshop, Helm demonstrated a simple shuffle beat to a room of aspiring drummers and said pointedly, "This groove has moved people for 100 years. Now everyone thinks they need to reinvent the wheel every 4 bars." In Helm's mind, Copeland represented an emerging epidemic of overcomplication. Drummers who played to impress other drummers rather than serve the song. He didn't hate Copeland's skills. He hated what those skills were being used for. Where Helm cherished subtlety and silence, Copeland filled every corner of the rhythm with flurries of hi-hats and ghost notes. Helm believed music needed room to breathe, and to him, Copeland's dense style was choking that air out, one overpacked measure at a time. It wasn't personal, it was philosophical. Helm saw Copeland as a symbol of drumming's intellectualization, where groove was no longer something you felt, it was something you overanalyzed. And in Helm's world, that wasn't progress, it was betrayal. To Levon Helm, Phil Collins wasn't a pop star, he was a cautionary tale. Watching Collins rise from the art rock complexities of Genesis to solo superstardom in the 1980s, Helm saw something tragic. A drummer who had all the technical precision in the world but none of the human spark that gave rhythm its soul. Helm's disdain grew with each gated reverb drum hit, with each surgically clean studio recording where spontaneity was crushed under the weight of perfection. According to former Atlantic Records engineer Tom Dowd, Helm once listened to a Collins drum track and shook his head in dismay, saying, "Phil's got everything technically perfect, but where's the heart?" Helm wasn't impressed by calculated fills or slick production. He believed music should breathe, stumble, and surprise, things no drum machine or overly rehearsed session ever allowed. As Collins became the template for 1980s studio drumming, polished, processed, and utterly reliable, Helm saw an art form being drained of its blood. In his words, Collins had turned drumming into an assembly line job where every beat sounds exactly like the last one. At a 1986 session, Helm reportedly refused to use electronic processing, telling the engineer, "I want people to hear actual drumsticks hitting actual drums, not some computer's idea of what that should sound like." For Helm, every overproduced beat Collins played was a nail in the coffin of raw musical honesty. He didn't just reject the sound, he rejected the ideology. While Collins championed consistency and control, Helm championed chaos and chemistry. To him, Collins wasn't drumming anymore. He was managing an assembly line. And as Collins inspired a wave of imitators eager to replicate his spotless sound, Helm's fears deepened. He wasn't angry at Phil the person. He was devastated by what Phil the brand represented. A new generation of drummers trained to prioritize marketability over magic. And that, to Helm, was drumming's slow death disguised as commercial success. Levon Helm's resentment toward Charlie Watts, the understated backbone of the Rolling Stones, ran deeper than musical preferences. It cut into the roots of American rhythm and blues culture itself. While millions saw Watts as a dignified interpreter of the blues, Helm saw something far more unsettling. A musician praised for mastering a tradition he didn't fully live or understand. To Helm, Watts represented what he called tourist blues, perfectly timed, technically sound, but missing the blood, struggle, and soul that defined the music's origin. Helm, who had absorbed rhythm in the dusty streets and juke joints of Arkansas, often said, "You can't fake growing up with this music in your bones." Watching Watts replicate the groove from across the Atlantic, Helm reportedly bristled, saying, "Charlie plays those rhythms clean and proper, but he's missing the dirt and pain that created them." The tension wasn't about race or geography, it was about experience. While Helm had lived the stories behind the grooves, Watts had studied them in books and records. And to Helm, that academic approach reduced something sacred into something merely stylish. What made the situation worse was the global applause Watts received, often hailed as one of the most influential drummers in history. Meanwhile, countless, unsung heroes from the American South, drummers who shaped the genre from within, remained in the shadows. Helm wasn't blind to Watts's technical strengths, but he viewed the acclaim as cultural appropriation dressed in rock and roll glamour. In private conversations, Helm lamented that Watts's rhythms lacked the emotional scars that give blues its bite. "He learned blues from records, not from life," he once told a colleague, "and it shows in every beat." The bitterness deepened during the Stones' peak years in the 60s and 70s, when British rock was being celebrated as the savior of the blues, while the very communities that birthed the genre were being left behind. Helm didn't just feel left out, he felt betrayed. The drums to him were not just instruments, they were storytelling devices forged in pain, joy, and survival. Watts, in Helm's eyes, was reading a story he hadn't lived, and yet was being crowned its master. It wasn't personal disdain, it was historical frustration. Helm saw Charlie Watts as a symbol of how the music industry could overlook authenticity in favor of clean mimicry, and it haunted him that true rhythmic heritage was being diluted in exchange for polished British cool. Of all the names that ignited Levon Helm's fury, none did so quite like Ringo Starr. Unlike the others on this list, whose technical bravado or conceptual approaches clashed with Helm's values, Ringo's offense was something far more painful. To Helm, the celebration of mediocrity. The fact that Ringo Starr, drummer of the Beatles, was routinely called one of the greatest drummers in history, despite his simplistic playing style, drove Helm into a quiet, simmering rage that would last decades. According to close friends and music executives, Helm would watch Beatles tributes and visibly wince as praise was heaped onto Starr, reportedly muttering, "Ringo gets called one of the greatest drummers alive for playing simple beats any competent musician learns in their first year." For Helm, who had spent a lifetime crafting subtle, emotionally driven rhythms that served not just the music but the moment, Starr's worldwide acclaim was not just frustrating, it was devastating. He believed the music world had been blinded by the Beatles' cultural magnitude and had forgotten what great drumming actually was. It wasn't that Starr played poorly. It was that his work, in Helm's view, was utterly unremarkable, elevated only by the fame of the band he played in. Meanwhile, true masters of the craft, drummers who bled soul into every beat and studied their instrument like a sacred scripture, were being ignored. At a 1987 industry dinner, when the conversation turned to Beatles drumming, Helm reportedly stood up and left, later confiding to his wife, "It breaks my heart that mediocrity gets worshipped while excellence gets overlooked." Starr's continued presence in greatest drummer lists and tributes only widened the wound. Helm wasn't bitter for himself. He was bitter for all the unsung drummers who never got their due. The ones who played in smoke-filled southern clubs with genius-level precision and never got a record deal. He saw in Ringo the ultimate symbol of recognition gone wrong. A man adored for the timing of his opportunity, not the quality of his technique. To Helm, that wasn't just a misstep, it was an insult to the very art of drumming. In Ringo Starr, Levon Helm saw the painful truth of a music industry more concerned with image than integrity, and it haunted him until the very end. As we close the chapter on Levon Helm's unflinching critique of 6 of the most iconic drummers in modern music, a deeper question emerges. Not just about rhythm, technique, or tradition, but about the soul of music itself. Helm's judgments were never casual. They were piercing, rooted in a lifetime of playing music that didn't just entertain, but carried the weight of a culture, a struggle, a people. From Tommy Lee's pyrotechnic circus shows to Ringo Starr's minimalist beats, Helm saw a pattern that disturbed him to the core. A global audience embracing flash, polish, or association, while turning a blind eye to the drummers who truly lived the music. And perhaps that's the source of his deepest frustration. Helm believed that rhythm wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about knowing why those notes mattered. He wasn't content with music that sounded good. He demanded music that felt real. Yet, in that same pursuit of authenticity, Helm also revealed something else: his own vulnerability. Behind every stinging critique and gritted-teeth interview, quote, was a man who watched the world change around him and struggled to reconcile the past he cherished with the present that often dismissed it. Did he hate Tommy Lee's antics because they betrayed drumming's sacred purpose, or because they were being rewarded? Did Ringo's meteoric rise gnaw at him because the playing was simple, or because the music industry had taught him that simplicity, when packaged correctly, mattered more than mastery? Was it integrity, or was it a slow burn of overlooked greatness, watching others climb podiums he believed they hadn't earned? These questions linger, uncomfortable and complex. Helm was not just defending groove and soul. He was mourning their disappearance from the spotlight. And in his mourning, he may have become both the voice of conscience and the echo of a time slipping away. But maybe that's why his opinions still matter. Because in a world where metrics and media often dictate legacy, Helm reminded us that art is still supposed to mean something. That a drum beat, no matter how simple or complex, should carry with it the heartbeat of lived experience, not just digital perfection or brand association. And perhaps that's where Helm's story hits hardest. Not in the names he criticized, but in the values he refused to compromise. So the question now is not just who he hated, but what he was trying to save. As viewers, fans, and musicians, we're left to decide, was Levon Helm a bitter gatekeeper of fading traditions, or a courageous voice calling out the truth while the world clapped for illusion? The answer may lie in your playlist, in the rhythms you choose to honor, and in whether you're moved more by groove or by glitz.